Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy. But America's agriculture landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertising campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. From the producers who make your food to the store where you buy the final product and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Whether you like them or not, it's very likely you are eating foods and food products that are made with ingredients that come from GMO crops. GMO crops are used to make ingredients such as cornstarch, corn syrup, corn oil, soybean oil, or granulated sugar that Americans eat. There are even fruits and vegetables that are available in GMO varieties, such as potatoes, summer squash, apples, papayas, and pink pineapples. Although GMOs are in a lot of the foods we eat, most of the GMO crops grown in the United States are used for animal food. We will look at GMOs in Kansas as we visit local farmers and GMO specialists on this episode of Real Ag. Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
There are only a few GMO crops grown in the United States. Some of these GMOs make up a large percentage of the overall crops grown in the United States. Crops such as soybeans, corn, sugar beets, canola, and cotton are just a few of the GMO crops grown. Many GMO plants are used to make ingredients that are used for other food products, such as cornstarch. The U.S. Department of Agriculture maintains a list of bioengineered foods available throughout the world. So, what are GMOs, and how prevalent are they on Kansas farms?
GMOs stand for genetically modified organisms. And so to break that down, the genetics is basically the genes, so the traits that are actually in all organisms. The modified is the fact that we will actually go in and we will change some of the coding regions of the genes. And the organism is basically any living organism. So that could include plants, animals, bacteria.
And genetically modified crops are those that the DNA sequence, the genetic DNA of that crop has been manipulated for some type of reason to bring forth some benefit to that crop in terms of its production or in terms of the commodity that's produced from it. Not all crops are genetically modified. So in the state of Kansas, the primary genetically modified crops that exist in our state include corn and soybeans. Sorghum is a big crop in our region, is not genetically modified. Sunflowers are not genetically modified. Wheat is not genetically modified. So to answer the question about percentage of Kansas farmers that are raising genetically modified crops, if they have corn or they have soybeans, then 94% of all those corn and soybean acres in the state of Kansas were genetically modified. 0% of the wheat was, 0% of the sorghum was, 0% of the sunflowers are. There are some other genetically modified crops in American agriculture. Cotton is, sugar beets, and some others that we don't raise in Kansas, but it's corn and soybeans here in our state that are.
GMOs are highly misinformed throughout the consumer market. There is only 10 crops currently grown and approved within the U.S. for GMO, that are GMO crops, okay? So a lot of these marketing campaigns that you're seeing at the store for tomatoes and even water, those aren't even eligible to be GM crops. And so it's very interesting to me that they've slapped the label on there saying non-GMO. It's a fear tactic. And so GM crops are genetically modified crops.
This isn't something new. Genetic modification's been going on forever. It's been going on since Adam and Eve, and that's the ability for animals and plants to adapt themselves over time to the environment. It is the fact that I'm taller than my dad, and my son will be taller than me. Those are the genetic modifications that are coming along. Part of that is diet-based, part of it is health, etc. Through technology, you have the ability to influence that or to speed it up by identifying a very relevant piece of germplasm from one cell and moving it to another, or changing the strain or the sequence of the chromosomes to help make a plant healthier, to help make it more productive, to make it more drought resistant. That's how those came about.
Examples of GM products. One of the really exciting ones that happened was way back in 1982, and actually happens to be insulin. Insulin was one of the first GM products that were put out. And what the researchers did is they isolated the gene from humans that makes the insulin, and they put it into a bacteria. And then the bacteria would grow and excrete the insulin into the in the environment. You would harvest that, and that's basically what insulin people use for diabetes today. So I think that's really what started a lot of this work. With the plants really started commercially in 1996 with a transgenic tomato, then closely followed after that was the Roundup Ready soybeans. And the progress is still going on. I mean, we're finding other traits that we have. So for the plants, for example, we've got the herbicide and insect resistance. Those are the major players today. But we also have soybeans that are genetically engineered for oil modifications. So to make either healthier oils or biodiesel. And then you go on and you can look at the world. It's just not a U.S. process. It's a worldwide process where we have, I believe it's currently 30 countries across the world that are growing transgenic plants. And it covers 6.7 billion acres since 1996 have been growing transgenic crops. So we've got a lot of products out there. In this country, we mentioned that we have corn, soybean, and cotton are the primary ones, but we also have transgenic squash, we have Arctic apples, these apples that don't brown. We've got potatoes that have pathogen resistance and anti-browning, and eggplant in Bangladesh. We've got safflower in Australia. So there's a lot of different things. Rice in Indonesia now. And so we've got lots of transgenic products that are out there on the market. In Kansas, the three prevalent ones are maize or corn, soybean, and then cotton down in the southeast.
The characteristics of all living organisms are determined by their genetic makeup and its interaction with the environment. The genetic makeup of an organism is its genome, which in all plants and animals is made of DNA. The genome contains genes, regions of DNA that usually carry the instructions for making proteins. It is these proteins that give the plant its characteristics. Genetic modification is a technology that involves inserting DNA into the genome of an organism. To produce a genetically modified plant, new DNA is transferred into plant cells. How are GMOs made?
What we do in the laboratory is we will isolate the DNA. This is the material that the genes are made of. And we will go in and we will manipulate it in such a way that we will take pieces of that from a different organism and splice it into the genetic makeup of the plant that we're trying to genetically engineer. It is more of a chemical process where we actually will go in and we will isolate DNA from the plant that we want to put the DNA into. And then we'll take the gene or the DNA piece from the other organism and physically put those together in a test tube. And then we will take that material and then insert it into a cell of a plant. And then take that cell, grow that up to an entire new plant itself. So the genetic information that we have is actually introduced into the genome of that plant.
You're splicing, you're changing that genetic makeup and then rebreeding that plant over and over again. So the plant has this new genetic makeup. And so that's natural. Like you don't have to do it for every seed every year because you've now bred it into the plant. For GM crops, most of them take 7 minimum, but generally 11 years before it's considered safe on the commercial market. So that's greenhouse testing, that's field testing, that's efficacy, residue safety, all of these things. And so CRISPR is just a newer technology that's happening, but it's really the same concept of GM crops.
There's a process called transformation, which happens in a lab, and essentially what happens is you'll have your target plant, for example, your corn cultivar, growing in tissue culture. You can use bacteria. There's different ways to introduce the new gene, but one of the more common ones is you can use a bacteria to infect the plant in tissue culture, and the gene will be incorporated into the target plant. But that's sort of the traditional way to do this.
Most of the GMO crops grown today were developed to help farmers prevent crop and food loss and control weeds. The three most common traits found in GMO crops are a resistance to certain damaging insects, tolerance to certain herbicides used to control weeds, and resistance to certain plant viruses. Farmers can use fewer spray pesticides when they plant GMO crops. This saves farmers money and reduces the number of pesticides that end up on crops. When farmers use herbicide-tolerant crops, they reduce the need to till the soil to control weeds. No-till planting helps to improve soil health, reduce soil erosion, lower fuel and labor use, and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere. Growing virus-resistant crops can also help farmers produce a sustainable, safe food supply while increasing the stability of their livelihoods. Are GMOs necessary in Kansas?
I believe that GMOs are necessary for our current production of crops in this country, and you can consider these things as a tool in the toolbox that we have, and it combines with the other technologies such as conventional plant breeding, whether we are using other tools for precision agriculture.
Along with things like better management practices, GMOs they're just another tool that we can put in that toolbox. They're really powerful because we know exactly what gene we are putting into the plant and what it does. And so that allows us to make really targeted changes to the productivity of the plant with minimal other side effects. And that's as opposed to conventional breeding, which has to change the entire genome of the plant all at the same time. And therefore, we can end up with trade-offs between different genes that help with different things. For example, you might breed something to have better disease resistance, but it could come at a trade-off of lower growth rates or something like that.
So rust in wheat, great example of taking a breeding program, a wheat breeding program, and identifying that particular strain and then propagating that into the plant so the plant itself developed a natural resistance to rust. And that's those sorts of that's all GMO. That's all modifying the genetic code of that particular plant. But those sort of get overlooked. Those are all very positive benefits of GMOs, and I think a lot of times it's easy for folks to demonize something that's not well understood for the sake of saying, well, it's change is hard, I just seem to stay where we've been, and we can't afford to do that. We've got to continue to be at the cutting edge of development and productivity.
It's basically to make agriculture more precise, more efficient. One of the things we have to worry about is coming up in the future, we're going to have a population problem in the world. We will see by 2050, we'll see probably about 23% more people on this planet, and we need to feed them in some way. Our current production is not going to meet those needs, and so every little bit that we can do to try to improve our efficiency, improve our yield, is going to be very important in trying to maintain our goals on feeding the world.
We have a hungry population, and the GMO crops provide us management tools that allow us to produce an abundant and a safe food supply. There is demand by some consumers, and this demand varies by regions of the world. Our European customers are more demanding of non-GMO crops. And so we need to produce crop for them, more so than we do here in Kansas. The question about do we need them in Kansas? In today's competitive business environment of trying to make a large multi-million-dollar farming operation work, it requires the tools, the best management tools that we can find to have a chance of producing the crop and the supply that's needed for our markets, and have a chance to remain in business as a farmer and keep doing it year after year.
There is research going on actively looking at genetic modifications of animals. One of the big things is that is out and actually is approved by the FDA is genetically engineered salmon that can grow twice as fast. And so that's on the market today. It's been shown that it was safe to eat. Other things we've been doing, for example, in the medical industry, is looking at pigs and removing some of the proteins that cause rejections to organs. And so the idea here is to use the pig organs for xenotransplantation, taking a pig kidney and using that rather than finding a human donor. And so they've been having some very active and promising results in that technology. So we've been doing things like that. Also with poultry, there's been methods of trying to reduce the amount of phytic acid. This is a phosphate contamination in the excrement of the poultry. And so there's ways of maybe editing the poultry so that they can utilize more phosphorus. We also have transgenic insects, and one of the big examples here is mosquitoes. So there's a company, Oxitec, that is actually producing transgenic mosquitoes, and these mosquitoes are designed, when they release, they will mate with the females, and the females will be sterile. And the whole idea for this is to release these in areas that have human diseases caused by the insects, such as Zika, yellow fever, and dengue. And they've actually released these in South America, some of the Latin American countries, and just recently they released some in Florida as well.
Many federal agencies play an important role in ensuring the safety of GMOs. Multiple federal agencies work to ensure the safety of GMOs. Collaboration and coordination among these agencies helps make sure food developers understand the importance of a safe food supply and the rules they need to follow when developing new products using genetic engineering. FDA's Voluntary Plant Biotechnology Consultation Program evaluates the safety of food from new GMOs before they enter the market. This program allows developers to work with FDA on a product-by-product basis. Despite the fact that genes being transferred occur naturally in other species, there are unknown consequences to altering the natural state of an organism through foreign gene expression. After all, such alterations can change the organism's metabolism, growth rate, and/or response to external environmental factors. These consequences influence not only the GMO itself, but also the natural environment in which the organism is allowed to proliferate.
So with non-GM crops, if you have a problem with weeds, well then you're going to have to control that. So in that situation, the GM crops would be preferable. There may be situations where it's a draw, where you don't, whether you have GM crops or not GM crops, you'll see no difference.
It is a trade-off, and one that I think is worth it. You're also going to allow, like if you change the genetic makeup in wheat, there's drought-resistant wheat. So you guys know, if you've been paying attention, climate change is huge right now at the federal level and what they're discussing internationally. And so if you're not taking the steps to continue the yields, because people aren't stopping reproducing. So we're asking 1.5% of the population to feed the remaining. And so the yields have to remain high, otherwise you're not gonna have cost-effective food.
Everything we do in our life has a trade-off. And so if we have a genetically modified corn crop that has been modified so that it has built into it plant protection from some type of pest, The trade-off that exists in that situation is I, as a farmer producer, pay more for my seed. I pay more for the genetics to plant the crop, so I pay for that cost up front. But the trade-off is I manage the pest very effectively. I don't spray for the pest, which is a great response for our environment, and I produce an abundant crop. And so in these instances, and this is part of where we have to as consumers and suppliers, come together to help everyone make their own decisions as to what they want. But the food that's produced from the genetically modified crops is very often of the highest quality because the pest has been managed more effectively with that mechanism built into the plant.
In certain situations, and it's always on a case-by-case basis. So you may have an area where you may have high insect pressure. And in this situation, if you're using conventional seeds that are not genetically engineered for insect resistance, you may have to do applications of insecticide or pesticides to prevent that insect from ruining your yields.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is the primary regulatory agency responsible for ensuring the safety of GMO and non-GMO foods for animals. The FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine manages this responsibility. FDA requires that all food for animals, like food for humans, be safe for animals to eat, be produced under clean conditions, contain no harmful substances, and be accurately labeled. Many industries stand to benefit from additional GMO research. CRISPR stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats, which are the hallmark of a bacterial defense system that forms the basis for CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing technology. Is often used loosely to refer to the various CRISPR-Cas9 and CPF1 and other systems that can be programmed to target specific stretches of genetic code and to edit DNA at precise locations. This often brings about ethical questions on the uses of genetic modification and engineering. So what is CRISPR, and how does the future look for GMOs in our world?
It's gene editing, okay? And so gene editing, what happens is, rather than introducing a whole big piece of new DNA into the plant, what you're doing is you're tweaking the genetic code in very precise areas. You're changing one base or two bases. And what that does is that may change the conformation of a protein in the plant, which will then give it different properties. And so with this method, this method can be attained by mutational breeding, which we have been doing since the 1950s. It's just that it's more precise. The genome editing looks specifically at a certain sequence, and we change that little piece of DNA in there.
The CRISPR technology enabled plant breeders to rapidly accelerate their development of improved genetics. That's been a big part of what we've seen in the last 10 years, has been able to take what might have used to have taken a plant breeder's full lifetime career can be accomplished now in a 5 to 6 year period. And we can get very precise in doing very specific things for very specific outcomes.
One of the reasons it's such a big deal is because there's so few side effects. Because it's such a tiny, precise change that's being made to the plant's genome, it's very rare for there to be any sort of side effects, even less common than it was for the more traditional GMOs. We'll have to be careful to select the right background genetic material for the plant because, it's expensive to develop one of these gene-edited modified plants. And so you tend to do it only in like a certain cultivar or something. And so the major potential downside is, again, the loss of genetic diversity. If you have one cultivar that has received an awesome CRISPR genome edit, then you try to grow that across many, many fields and it's the only thing being grown, then you don't have very much genetic diversity in the rest of the genome. It's going to be completely homogeneous. And that increases the risk of for example, a new pathogen or a new pest running through. And if there's no genetic diversity, it increases the risk that there won't be any resistant plants. And so it's more likely to become an epidemic.
Lots of work going on right now where people are looking at gene editing for soybeans. I believe that there's very close to being put out one for drought resistance. Our lab, together with Edward Auchinoff, and there's several other labs that are working on wheat, trying to do gene editing for different things such as yield, trying to prevent viruses, possibly even heat tolerance. So there's lots of areas we can do. Across the world, there's other things such as bananas. There is a project right now trying to work on bananas so that they are more resistant to fungus. Not related to Kansas agriculture, but bananas, you can't breed bananas. They are sterile, and so in order to get new cultivars, you need to be doing these mutational breedings or gene editing.
Certain types of GMOs have a disclosure that lets you know if the food or ingredients you're eating is a bioengineered food. The National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard defines bioengineered foods as those that contain detectable genetic material that has been modified through certain lab techniques and cannot be created through conventional breeding or found in nature. The standard requires that by 2022, food makers, importers, and certain retailers label foods that are bioengineered or have bioengineered ingredients. Foods sold in the United States that meet the definition of bioengineered food must have information on their packaging using one of the approved methods, including text on the package that says bioengineered food, the bioengineered food symbol, or directions for using your phone to find the disclosure. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Real Ag on GMOs. As always, you can check out this and other episodes of Real Ag on SmokyHillsPBS.org. From the producers at Smoky Hills PBS, this has been Real Ag. Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.